Grey Column is this enormous work of art. It'll stand 12 feet high, about 8 feet wide. It's 3,500 pounds.
I said to him in a recent conversation, I said, Dwayne, has anyone in your entire life ever accused you of thinking small?
Dwayne was doing stuff that had never been done before, inventing techniques that were unheard of.
He was a real innovator and willing to take risks with a new material, and he was willing to use it in a large way that the rest of us were probably afraid to do at the beginning, but not Dwayne.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, apologies for those of you who saw the movie at 6 o'clock and just thought, oh my God, we have to watch the whole thing all over again. On behalf of the GCI, the Getty Conservation Institute, it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here tonight to our very special evening with Wain Valentine. I'm Tom Lerner, Senior Scientist at the GCI and Head of our Modern and Contemporary Art Research Initiative. And before we start the discussion with Dwayne, and I know you're here to hear him, if you'll bear with me, I would like to do two things. First of all is just to remind you to turn those cell phones off, please. And secondly, I just want to very briefly spend a few moments to put the discussion into some sort of context, in particular with relation to the exhibition we've put on at the GCI, thank you, from start to finish, Wain Valentine's Grey Column. This is part of the Pacific Standard Time Initiative, which is now in full swing across Southern California. And I had thought I would just talk a little bit about the Pacific Standard Time Initiative, but actually I'm not going to. We're going to get straight on to Dwayne. If anyone wants to know about it, just Google Pacific Standard Time, and all the information will be there. What I did want to say is something about the GCI. It's a sort of an unknown, a lesser-known program of the Getty. Our core mission is to advance conservation practice in the cultural heritage field. And we're embarking on a major research program at the moment into the many and often quite varied issues and challenges of conserving modern contemporary art. And so when Pacific Standard Time appeared, we saw an amazing opportunity to explore and raise awareness of some of the issues that we're grappling with. Grey Column, you see behind you, is an extraordinary work of art, as you've just seen and heard. And our exhibition focuses on three main aspects of this piece. So if you'll bear with me, I promise this, well, this is one of two slides that has bullet points. All of the others is just images. Essentially, our exhibition is a little bit different with the Conservation Institute. We are interested in things other than just the artwork itself. And I won't go through all of these things, but essentially the three things we're looking at are the sort of technical process, how Dwayne made this enormous work of art, and it's an extraordinary story that we'll get into later in the evening. The conservation implications, as I just mentioned, there are some very different challenges facing conservators looking at modern contemporary art, especially when the artist is still alive. It's often a very strong voice that you have to deal with. And finally, of course, Grey Column, as itself, standalone, is an amazing work of art, and there's a lovely story about it, which we'll also get into in just a second. Before Dwayne thinks this is a monologue of Tom Lerner, let me just very briefly introduce him. I expect everybody who's come here tonight knows something about Dwayne, so I'll keep this very, very brief, and we'll let Dwayne tell most of the story himself. He was born in 1936 in Colorado, where his early experiences polishing rocks and painting cars fostered a deep interest in reflective surfaces, translucent, and industrial processes. He moved to Los Angeles in 1965 and was soon participating in group shows, for example, the Dwan Gallery in Los Angeles and the Whitney in New York by 1966, and had his first solo exhibition at Ace Gallery here in 1968. Although working in many media, he has perhaps become best known for his works in cast polyester resin. Indeed, that's what Grey Column is made out of, in which he was an early pioneer to produce monumental sculptures that reflect and distort the light and space that surround them. So tonight, what I thought we'd do is we're going to delve into three areas. There'll be plenty of time for audience questions once we've done this. And then we'll wrap up at the end with a reception outside where hopefully you'll have a chance to speak to him personally. The three areas, and we're going to start each of these sections with another short video clip just to kind of set the scene, and then I promise you I'll let him talk. The first section we're going to start with is about your move to Los Angeles, Duane, and your recollections of the Venice art scene in the 60s and 70s, the general setting there. The second one, we're going to move on to the more technical section, if you'll bear with us, the sort of science bit, looking a little bit more about the resin you had to create and what that meant and what it enabled you to do with these large polyester pieces. And then finally, we'll take you through some of the discussions and events we grappled with when we were talking about putting on this exhibition to do particularly with the conservation of this piece. So I think you are ready, Emma. Could you just roll the first film clip, please?
Los Angeles in the 60s and 70s was a very tiny art scene. Some were on the coast, most were in Venice.
Well, there wasn't really an art scene when I first came down here. There was just a lot of empty buildings with cheap rent.
Studios were a dime a dozen. It was cheap. My studio was $75 a month.
Art theory was not part of the conversation. It was about having a good time. Let's go surfing. Let's go to Barney's.
Venice was a very kind of tight community there.
They kind of embraced me from the beginning. They made me part of their club, so to speak.
It was kind of a frontier. An artist could sort of explore things kind of freely and on their own.
Turns out it was a pretty rich scene with a lot of what turned out to be pretty talented people. Duane came from somewhere else and sort of like appeared.
He was very cute. He had blonde curls, and all the ladies loved him. Very debonair and charming, and very dedicated to his work.
He was absolutely fearless. You know, he would come up and say, I'm going to make a disc, an 8-foot-high disc. Oh, yeah, great, Duane.
Came from Colorado.
In Colorado, where I was living and painting and making sculpture, I had a love affair with the sky and the clouds and the mountains. When I moved to California, the smog became a substance.
The light in Southern California is totally different.
And the quality of the light, it had a body to it. It was just thrilling.
Duane was doing stuff that had never been done before, inventing techniques that were unheard of.
I think that Duane has influenced a great number of artists, and he's got this generosity that is very engaging.
You ready, Duane? Now it's your turn. So while we pull up the first slide, can you just start us off with when you moved to California? We said it was 1965, but what brought you here? What was that like?
Well, I'd always thought about coming to California because California was like the place that everybody wanted to go. And I was making sculpture and painting in Boulder, Colorado, and working on large pieces out in my studio, which is the backyard, and snow and ice, which I didn't mind too much, but very hard to move big pieces around. So I'd always thought, wow, it'd be great if I could go to California. And at one point, a gentleman from UCLA, Jack Hooper, came to the University of Colorado for a summer to be a guest artist for the summer. And Jack saw what I was doing. He said, well, I want to learn how to do this. So I told him there's nothing to do it. You just mix a little bit of this and a little bit of that in your own color, and it gets hard and you've got it. So at any rate, so he invited me to come to UCLA to teach artists how to use plastic. And in the meantime, I'd been teaching off and on at the University of Colorado part-time. And the last semester I was there, suddenly the head of the art department at Denver campus of the University of Colorado suddenly died. They needed someone to fill his shoes like overnight. And I had taught most of the courses that he was teaching. And the head of the art department said, "Duane, would you take over Jack's job?" And I said, "Well, what's our remuneration?" And they told me, and I just hummed to myself, "California, here I come." And so I built a 8-foot by 8-foot by 20-foot long trailer out of plywood on an old boat trailer frame and filled it with all my detritus and moved to California like the Jodes, with a Saint Bernard and 3 cats and 3 kids. So when we got here, Jack wanted us to move into one of his apartments that he was working on, but it wasn't ready. So for the first 3 months, we slept in his garage on the floor, which was no problem at all. We're just lucky to have a place to stay in Venice. And from there on, I was working with plastics, and a dealer friend of mine, John Weber, happened to come to the studio, and he asked his wife, Nina Weber, "Come here, Nina, you have to see this." And so she came around and saw it, and John said, "I want to show this in the summer show, the group summer show." And he did. And during that summer, the head curator of the Getty came through Los Angeles, saw one piece, and said, "I want this to go to the opening show of the Getty," or the Whitney. And so it went to the Whitney, and that really gave my career a kick in the fanny, and it just got better and better after that.
And Duane, in the clip there, you talked about the quality of the light in Los Angeles, and this has come up with many of the artists. So did you know about that before you moved, or was it something that you discovered?
No, I didn't know about that, but I was dealing with paintings of the sky and clouds in Boulder, but there is no sky. It's this giant blue hole. And I was amazed to come to California, and the sky was substance because of the smog. I always said you could take a big saw and cut down a chair out of the smog and sit on it. But it made a beautiful quality of light at the beach. And there were a bunch of artists living there. Larry Bell was living there, and Bob Irwin, and Billy L. Bingston, and on, Tony Berlant. And that light became a part, I think, of all of our work. And that took me to, I'd wanted to do pieces in cast polyester, which I'd started doing in junior high. But there's no way to cast any large volume in it. So I worked with Pittsburgh Plate Glass Resins Company here in Los Angeles and through Hastings Plastic in Santa Monica, and invented a process whereby large pieces of polyester could be cast. And it just went from here to there. Started with small ones, and many pieces cracked because they got too hot and had to figure out the proportions of the catalyst, and so it wouldn't crack. And had a ton piece sitting by the back door once, and it was smoking and cracking. And I had my forklift right in front of it so I could push it out in the alley if it started a fire.
I'm going to just stop there. I've got the easiest and most difficult job tonight. The easiest job, I can just ask him a question, and he'll talk for an hour and a half. The difficulty is we want to talk about this later, so I'm going to really back in. We will revisit this because this is such an important part of your story. But just, you spoke in that clip about the tight community of Venice, and you mentioned, Larry Bell and Bob Irwin, Billy Al. Was that your close-knit group of colleagues and friends, or were there other people that were important?
It was very hard to break into that. Again, I have to thank my friends who brought me out here, Jack and Nancy Hooper. I think it was the second week I was in town, and it may be the first or second dinner party they did. One of those dinner parties was with Bob Irwin and his wife and Ed Moses and Avilda. And I thought, oh my gosh, I get to meet all these guys when I first come here. And of course, I didn't realize how important they were till much later, because things were progressing in my life just step by step. And every step was a opening up of what my life. And again, the third, fourth week I was here, Nancy and Jack invited Frank Gehry and his partner David O'Malley for dinner. And Frank was very interested in art and wanted to meet all the artists in Venice, so that was a happy marriage of Frank and the artists coming together.
That was something that actually I didn't know about when we were doing the movie, and we were talking about people that collect your work, and Frank Gehry's name came up, and I think that's interesting to a lot of people, that he felt very sort of shunned by his fellow architects, but really welcomed by the group that you were mixing with. So was that actually how it was?
Well, I think, it became great working with Frank, all hoping we would get a commission for some large project Frank was doing, and just the fact that he was an architect, and I almost became an architect. I studied architecture, and when I found out architects couldn't do the things that Frank Gehry does, I decided, well, architecture is not the department for me, so it was a choice between architecture and art. And when I found out that architecture was so strict, and I'd be doing other architects' drawings and very uninventive, well, for really at that time, for most of my life. So it was, sculpture was a perfect direction for me. And it moved from actually I was doing the fiberglass pieces first. I wanted to do those in cast polyester, which didn't exist, to be able to cast in those large forms. And as a kid, I'd worked in the boat shops in Colorado and knew how to use fiberglass and polyester. So the easiest way for me to realize these pieces were to make these pieces in a mold with fiberglass and plastic, which I did and that was one of the first pieces that got me into Dwan Gallery. And I did those for years till I developed this process where I could cast large pieces.
And then, we jumped to your move to LA, but this is such a wonderful photo that we're going to drag you right back. This is you, isn't it, on the bonnet of your father's car, back in Colorado. So,
That's me with my first Stetson, and which is the same size I was, and my cowboy boots, which I still have there. The seams are split open, but I still have my great-grandfather's nickel-silver spurs. And behind that Lincoln Zephyr was my dad and his Stetson. And he was from Texas. And always thought of himself as a cowboy. But then there were no cattle to herd anymore. And so what did the cowboys do? They became heavy equipment operators. So Dad was between selling cars and operating heavy equipment. And we had horses, and I was interested in horses, and I always trying to draw a horse. But horses are very difficult to draw. And in the city library, up on a shelf that I could barely reach, was drawings of the old masters. And so I drug it down and looked at it, and there were all these beautiful drawings by Ang and Rubens of these beautiful nude women. I thought, the hell with horses. I know what I'm going to do.
Exactly. I want to jump right forward now, right forward to 1975 or 6, I guess. So Grey Column, which we have here, was actually one of two similar pieces that were installed. But as everyone can probably see, the pieces are a different orientation in this photo. So can you just do the background to this commission?
The orientation of the column here was supposed to be made to be vertical in a building that Skidmore, Owings and Merrill did in Deerfield, Michigan. But the head guy at Baxter Travelmental Labs decided that ceiling was too high for people in the company to be comfortable with. So they lowered the ceiling. So therein there was no way to stand it up. So I decided, the two columns were supposed to go side by side, so I decided to to build them so they could go side by side flat. And at one point, it's kind of a joke on Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, one of the walls on the building fell off right towards the piece and knocked it over on a sofa and some chairs. And thank God there were no people there. We had picked them up with a spoon and a blotter. But they were afraid to put them back up. So, but on the way of doing these, I made a lot of small maquettes to figure out how to get the color balance, the catalyst balance so they wouldn't break apart. And I did 4 of them. And the first one cracked, and we took it to the dump. And the second one was too dark. Couldn't see through it well enough, so had to make more maquettes and eventually go to the one standing on their sides, which were poured on their sides. And they were moved to Chicago on their bases, which had wheels on them. And we took them to Deerfield, Illinois, I think it was, Deerfield. Rob will have to tell you. And Robbie and I went there and installed them. And they said they looked great when they first got there, but by the time they got polished, they were too reflective. So, but then the wall fell off, so we were kind of saved from that. And they had them in storage for a long time. But they moved to storage warehouse, and they asked me if I wanted to buy them back. But a young sculptor never has any money. It's all spent on the work already. So I said, well, I'd like to have them, but I can't afford them. So they're probably in the warehouse for another year or so. And they called me. They said, Dwayne, would you like to have these back? And I said, I'd love to have them back. They said, well, we're giving them to you. So they shipped them back to me in Venice. And 3 of them were, before this one came here, there's still 2 in a transoceanic container in my backyard. I have 6 that are jammed with artist detritus.
Yes, and we'll go through the whole process of making grey column, grey wall in the next section. And I think we've got time. I just wanted to one of the sort of, I guess, early myths of the whole Pacific Standard thing is the LA Art Center being very different from New York. But in fact, there was all this sort of cross-pollution going on. And you were no different. I mean, we've mentioned your Whitney show already. But a couple of things that stuck out with our research. And this is an image from 1967 when your Art in Residence program in Aspen. But in the middle there is Roy Lichtenstein. You're to Roy's right. To the left of him is Klaus Oldenburg. So this was an amazing Art in Residence program for you.
It was great for me because I got to meet these big guys and still became friends with them their whole lives. That's Adam D'Arcangelo on my left side and Les Levine on the right side of, well, I guess which way is up there, yeah. Next to Oldenburg. And we had a great summer. They gave us all housing, a stipend, and a studio. And I was making the shell pieces out of fiberglass, and Klaus was around the corner, and Alan was across the way, and Les Levine was next to me. And we did an artist open studio weekend for Aspen. And the city gave us great publication. A friend of ours owned the paper, and owned the radio station. So a lot of people came in, and Roy asked his wife, Dorothy, he said, I don't know what to do with this. What do I do? And so there was like an anteroom just before my studio, and there were 2 doors on it, and Roy had used doors in a lot of his works. So Dorothy said, Roy, why don't we do 2 doors? We'll do this one and do that one across from each other. And the first one walking into the room was Knock Knock, which I still own. And the room on the other side said Slam. And the weekend was just really great. And everybody was so casual and were interested in seeing what was going on. They didn't really comprehend it, but they were happy. And they also had a writers workshop up there at the same time of poetry. And so it was great to have the association between the writers and the artists. And the artists at that time were not well prepared to talk about their work. But the poets could talk directly about what they were doing, what they were putting together, and we'd ask them questions and vice versa. So it was a great summer.
The other one that really stood out to us was this, Dan Flavin. And a very unknown fact, but there are actually 20 pieces he made, and we're showing 3 here, which are titled, Untitled, To My Friend, Wain Valentine from 1990. So how did that relationship
Dan was a
develop?
great friend. We met in Stockholm. I was there to see my art dealer, Eva F. Bruin, and Dan was there installing a piece at the Stedelijk. So, and we happened to be at the same hotel. So, we had breakfast, lunch, and dinner together at one place or another, and became great friends. And as it comes out, really, Dan was the only artist in New York who understood what the artists here were doing. The involvement with light and the transparent color and transparent color spaces. And we were friends all of his life.
And just before we finish this section, this is the front page of the art section from the New York Times a few weeks back now, so before Pacific Standard Time opened. But the piece here that MoMA in New York acquired very recently, this was an article about the entire rehang of MoMA, and there's Wain Valentine, the picture that's used to talk about this story. That must have been quite a shock, quite a pleasant shock.
That they bought it, or that was in this room?
Well, both. But maybe there it is.
In this room, it was really wonderful and kind of melancholy at the same time. The room was full of works by all of my close friends who now passed away. Flavin and Judd and LeWitt and on and on. It was a great honor to be with all those guys.
Absolutely, and my biggest challenge here is just to try and move things on, because there's so much interesting stuff here. But I'd like to move on to the sort of second section, the sort of more technical stuff. And this particular clip we're going to show describes polyester resin. So this material that we're going to talk a lot about with Wain tonight. And I just want to draw your attention. You'll see it when you see the clip, but we had this wonderful collaboration with Commonwealth Projects who made this movie for us. And one of the sort of things we were looking for when we were trying to find a film company to do this was someone that could make the curing of polyester resin interesting. It's about as interesting as watching paint dry. But I think you'll agree that... Thanks a lot, Tom. Yes, right. They did a pretty good job, so when you're ready, Emma.
He was a real innovator, willing to take risks with a new material. Most of these resins were designed to be poured in very thin layers. This is why Wain had to develop his own resin.
In terms of the chemistry he did, he was quite an artist as well. It's useful to know what the words mean. So what does it mean to be unsaturated? What is an ester and what's a polyester? This is the set of molecules the artist is working with. These are examples of ester linkages. If you put many of them, poly, it's a polyester. They have the potential to link to other molecules. That's what the term unsaturated refers to. So you have molecules that are small and it's liquid-like, and at the moment that you want to create the solid, you can add a catalyst in, and it steals one of their electrons. So all of a sudden it puts them in kind of an excited, unstable state. So they attack their neighbor, and they're stuck together. But that one now is unhappy, so it attacks the next one. And then the neighbor says, I'm gonna steal one from my neighbor. And boom, 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 it runs through the whole system and connects it all together, stitching together the material, causing them not only to become longer, but also to link with each other. It's very highly cross-linked material, and it ultimately gives you this strong, clear resin.
There was a gentleman called Ed Rivet. he got Pittsburgh's plate glass resins division working with me, and we formulated the RS50112.
You know, Duane is like a craftsman, very facile, very professional, very deliberate, don't give up.
He was one of those people who would rapidly try new materials as they become available and then not be limited by them.
The fact that any of them came out as well as they did was something of a miracle. If a little tiny piece of dirt or something fell in, it was ruined.
The first large piece I tried to pour, it went wacky. It started to crack.
There was a strong panic mode. The whole thing was going to blow open.
It wasn't just about using new materials that a lot of these artists were doing. It was really about, you know, creating something that wasn't there. So this intersection between, you know, technique and science and art, it just seems to be encapsulated by this particular piece and this particular artist.
Well, so my first question, Duane, is how many double bonds does a polyester resin molecule have?
I'm sorry?
Were you paying attention to the chemistry? As we come to the first slide, so the story that really grabbed us, that sort of started us off on this venture with you, wasn't just that you were using new materials that a lot of artists were using, but you sort of had to invent this new one. And you wanted to make things, you know, very, very large scale. And you mentioned already, but in the clip also, this guy, Ed Rivet, who just seemed to be like a guardian angel or something, because he sort of suddenly seemed to appear in your life and helped you to create what you wanted. So just tell us a bit more about, you know, how you met Ed and how that whole...
I happened to be in Hastings Plastic one day, and the representative salesman from Pittsburgh was in there, and the owner of Hastings Plastic, Norrie Hastings, introduced me, and we started a conversation. I told him what I was doing. He said, well, let me come down to the studio and see what you're doing. So Ed came down to the studio, and I showed him what I was doing, and he said, well, let's see if we can't mix up a little of this and a little of that and make it work. So they would give me a plastic from Pittsburgh, and I would R&D it. And pretty soon they were giving me barrels. And it was all done by trial and error, empiric learning. You know, put this together, that together, like baking a cake. You put too much salt, it doesn't taste good. And the polyester was very much like that. And the piece here, the circle here on the left is the one that's upstairs. And the other one that's upstairs is well, this is the column which is leaning on its side. Because that was the only way to work on it actually as well.
So, I mean, you just mentioned this, the sort of trial and error. One of the sort of little gems we had in our exhibition is your formula book, you call it, which is sort of diary and bits of paper. Yeah. So we've got some sheets from it here where you wrote down all kinds of, you know, your trial and error. And I just pulled out 3 pages here. It's very hard to read from this monitor, but you know, this middle one is talking about a 6-foot slab, and you said cracks, destroyed, excess exotherm, which meant something a bit more scary than excess exotherm. And then you reduced to 100 grams of MEKP, the catalyst, and I guess you kept trying.
Kept trying. Everything was done. Both the catalyst and the color were way down on gram scale and adjusted to fit the gallons, square foot of gallons in the polyester barrel. And that went from there on up to the bigger size and bigger size. Of course, the larger it gets, the hotter it gets. So the less catalyst it takes. And the little ones, the smaller ones, would take about 3 or 4% of catalyst, and the big ones took a 0.004 gram per gallon. And slowly but surely got the resin figured out and how to keep it at a reasonable temperature. The big circle upstairs is actually the mold was a steel mold that we just saw a picture of one of the rings, spacer rings that I was lying in. And at the center, it doesn't get hot enough. So I started at the center with Chromalox wire and started winding it and taping it, winding, taping, until it became, the spaces in between became smaller, wider and wider. So it would get hot in the middle, but at the same time it got hot where it's thick. And I did that also with the molds for the sprayed up parts, the polyester and fiberglass parts. And finally came to a solution. Actually, by the time I made the large concave circles, I think I'd already figured it out. I made one 6-foot concave circle that was kind of the trial, and it worked. So then I went to the 8-foot ones.
And it sounds so sort of gentle, exotherm, but what does that actually mean in practice?
Well, the exotherm is when all the molecules rub together very hard and fast, or not so fast, and the faster they bang around each other, the hotter it gets. And as it gets hotter, of course, the thick section holds more heat than the thinner section. So it tends to heat and cure first, and then the center tends to cure the last, but by winding the Chromalox wire around. Chromalox is wire they commonly use in electric stoves, and they used to use those electric room heaters that had the wire that turned orange as it went around it. That's a Chromalox. And it's adjusted by length and width between the two strands. And I had a Verilux machine which adjusted the temperature, adjusted the amount of electricity going into the Chromalox. So it was kept roughly the inside temperature, the same height, same strength as the outside.
But in terms of what the sculpture, there was excess exotherming. Didn't
that cracked, yes.
It meant it was smoking, and you said you were...
Yep, I had one of them was the first 1,000-pound works I did. I had it sitting right in front of the back door. It was like a big delivery door that rolled up. And no, it didn't roll up, it folded up, come to think about it. But I had it sitting right by the edge and my forklift right in front of it, so if it started a fire, I could just push it out in the alley. It was scary, but in the end it was fun.
So I've just got a few slides here. Let's sort of talk through the basic process, and we'll maybe have you comment on each one. So, and some of these, well, a lot of them you seem to have your shirt off, but this is one we do. So essentially the resin is in the barrel, and it's mixed with initiator, and then the resin is poured into a mold, which you often made out of particle board and 2x4s. And then the polyester cures, the sides get taken off, it's cured, and you sand and polish it. So it all sounds sort of very straightforward. So let's start. This is the sort of first stage where you're taking one of the barrels of resin, these huge barrels of resin, and you're mixing in, I think, initiator or catalyst or pigment or something.
Yes, in a barrel. Takes about an hour to mix. Took about an hour to mix, and about an hour to strain it out. It was strained through. I got some surplus airplane fuel filters from Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, and it was a very fine stainless steel mesh. And that's what I used to, it was reticulated, which is like an old wire, paper air filter. So it held a lot of stuff back and let a lot of stuff in at the same time. And in that shot just before this, I discovered that by putting a slight amount of air pressure from the compressor at the top, it would force it out faster.
What did you see in this last one?
No, that was the one before.
Okay.
That one, yeah.
Yeah.
That's adjusting the air pressure on the top and the gate of the.
Yeah. And then the U-band coffee. What was that for?
That was the coffee I lived on in the studio, and then, of course, it wound up being mixing cans for everything.
Yeah. So lots of mixing in each barrel. And this is an image we've got up in the exhibition, blown up large scale, because I think it shows so much of this whole story. So this is you on the left, pushing the forklift with one of the barrels at the very, very sort of top, as far as the forklift can go up, And I think this is making grey column, because one of
Yes.
the pieces is already out to its right.
Yeah, because the dark one that was already done and too dark. And this lift was called a walker stacker. You had to either pull it or push it. And it was nice because you could get in a very small quarters, but at the same time, thank gosh I used to play football because it was rigorous pushing it back and forth.
And for something this size, how many barrels, how long did it take, all that kind of stuff?
There were 10 barrels for the piece that's upstairs. And so they would give me, I'd buy 10 barrels at a time, and they would usually give me a 5-gallon can of the resin so I could do R&D on it. So by the time we got it figured out, then I did the third and fourth casting of that piece. Because as I said, the first one went out the back door. Excuse me for looking down. I'm trying to see what's going on here.
But with grey column, I mean, you said this is 75, 76, so you'd sort of almost perfected this technique of the large pour. But even at this stage, you mentioned the first cast cracked.
Yes.
So and these were expensive failures, right? I mean, this is not a cheap operation.
I mean, it was cheap then compared to what it costs now. But the barrel, I think, was around $200, $250.
Yeah.
So it was not. It was an expensive hobby.
And in the clip where you mentioned the first large pour you did, it went wacky. What was that about?
Wacky. It all stayed together, but had a jillion really deep, heavy fissures in it. They were quite beautiful, and I didn't know what to do with it then, so I threw it away. Now I wish I had it. I know how to make the sides perfect now. But living and learning.
So then the resin was all poured in, and that had to be a very sort of controlled rate, because too fast the bubbles could form, and too slow it would just take forever. So this was about, we reckon, about 18 to 20 hours non-stop to pour this from start to finish.
Exactly.
And Keith Anderson, one of your assistants up the ladder, is in the audience. Right?
And Keith is here, sitting right here.
So then once it had been poured and the polyester cured, and you said, I think you stayed up watching it cure for like another 18 hours.
Yeah, one has to stay up continually because the resin shrinks as it cures. And one has to open the top part of the mold gently, 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 because it cures, it settles down. If the mold was tight, it would make big cracks going up where it shrunk. Yes, it was an all-night thing, sleep a couple hours, get up, feel the side of the mold, sleep for a few hours, get up, feel the side of the mold. And I never had heat or air conditioning in these studios. Didn't need air conditioning because it was in Venice. But I could have used some heat, but we had to keep a 48-inch fan going 24/7 to keep the fumes at least a little bit out of the back door. Larry Bill had the studio next door, and he came over and he apologized. He said, but the polyester in the air is ruining my plating machine. And he said, well, I'll buy you a fan. So I put a fan up. I don't know if it helped Larry at all, but that was the end of the complaining. And one of these big pieces is actually Norton Simon right now. The mold, I had no idea how much hydraulic pressure this liquid would do. And we got into the last barrel or barrel and a half, and the mold started breaking up. And Larry happened to walk over with a couple of friends. And I said, oh, God, I thought I was going to have a polyester floor in the studio. And Larry said, I've got some big timbers here, and I got some friends. And we went over, and Larry got 6 big pieces of timbers of wood, and we clamped those together with pipe clamps. And we saved the piece, but the one end of the Norton Simon piece, up in the corner, there's a few bubbles, because it didn't have time for all the bubbles to raise out.
And then at this stage, when the piece is cured and you're taking the mold apart, Do you know now if it's been successful or not, or do you still have to start to sand and polish to see
One
if
has
it's
to
really...
open it up, and one has to really sand part of it. And we didn't do it. By that time, we knew what to do. But
sanding.
But when we started, we'd have to polish up part of it to see what it looked like inside, because the pieces, the finish is not because of the idea of a finish. The idea of the surface was so that one could pass through the surface without being aware of the surface. It had one scratch on it, all you looked at was a scratch. And I was interested in that transparent colored space inside, and then to proceed through that and go to whatever was behind that, because they were very translucent and you could see through them.
And then, so this is sanding grey column, and this is you on the right, and Rob Janiger in the middle, and your son Nelson on the left, all of whom are here tonight, actually. And this, I mean, the sanding took forever as well, right? It wasn't like a couple of days, it was...
In fact, I always said it was 5,000 pounds, and Jack Brogan had refinished it, repolished it, put it on a scale. And he said it weighed 3,500 pounds. Well, I don't know that we could have sanded that much off of it, but there was a lot of sanding done on it.
And there were no shortcuts, were there? You couldn't sort of skip a grade of sandpaper?
No, it was like mowing a lawn.
Yeah.
You just start at one end, and you just go crossways all the way down, and then from the bottom of the top, the bottom of the top, the bottom of the top. And with different grits, and as soon as you got all the sand marks out of one grit from the next finer grit, one would go to a super finely grit up to 600, which one was able to polish it out of 600. Now we have 2,000, and it's almost polished before. I'm still finishing up some old pieces I had from that time.
And this isn't stage photo, is it? You did the sanding. You weren't just in there.
Oh, yes. I was, and I had my guys come in at 10 o'clock in the morning so I could get 2 hours work in, figured things out before they came in. And now it's become more of a standard. I have a friend who says, I wake up every day at the crack of noon. And that's about right.
And then finally on this section we have what's become a great image of you and Keith and Chris again. With your gas mask. And it seems to me danger. So we've seen, you know, these pieces are often over a ton. They can fall over. We have the toxicity of the resin. It's flammable. All the powder and the sanding and the poly. Was you worried about any of these more than others, or was it just?
Well, of course, we're always worried about the smell, and then as well about the dust. So I'd put Kleenex underneath the outer filter, so it filtered out the dust before it entered the charcoal filter, which filtered out the toxic fumes. And I don't know how old Keith was at this time. Maybe, what do you think, Keith? 16. Yeah, and Alan D'Arcangelo's son, who's on my other side. I knew him since he was about 3 years old, because he was about 3 when his dad and the family were in Aspen. So it just ended up at one point that got back together with Chris, and he was looking for work, and I said, hey man, you come on. So he worked on many pieces for many years, and he was an artist himself.
I remember when we spoke to Keith and Rob in the interview for the movie. Keith was saying this great story that he got the job of going out to the pharmacy to buy ladies' pantyhose and KY jelly. What was that about?
Not the KY jelly. rubber gloves,
like
please.
He said, that's right.
But yes, in the end, we found that the best system, even after the jet fuel filter, was to put 2 layers of nylon stockings on the bottom and wear them around the top, and they would bulge out, and they would really were a wonderful fine filter. better than the stainless was.
Okay, well actually we're doing very well for time. So we're going to start the final section now, and this is about, well, the clip is called Surface Matters, so it's the importance of the surface of your pieces, as well as it obviously will touch on the real sort of conservation aspects that we've had many discussions about. So let's watch that film.
The attempt is to finish them so that there are no scratches or imperfections on the surface, so that the surface itself begins to disappear in the eye of the viewer. And you don't notice it, but you look directly into the piece.
When I did shows with Duane, it was like I had to almost have a cattle prodder in the exhibition with a guard to stop people from going and touching the pieces.
They're very heavy material, yet when you look at them, there's a lightness about them with the light and the texture.
A lot of these works are fragile, which easily scratch, and also they do tend to age when exposed to light.
There is definitely a conflict between the immaculateness of the finish, the surface, and the natural phenomena of the piece aging.
It's very important to have them repolished.
The polishing thing happens, and then the piece is like new again.
You're not just dealing with the scratch, you have to irreversibly alter a lot of surface area in order for that scratch to disappear.
All things and beings change over time, and that history or experience, if you will, is visibly lost when you remove the surface.
There was a surface quality that was achieved that may be quite different than what's achievable now using more modern materials.
What's important to me as far as from a conservation perspective is the artist's originally intended experience. If there's been damage or something that distracts from being able to recreate that image, then the piece is lost. And I think it's okay to bring it back to that level.
We wanted to use this exhibition to kind of pose the question, would it be right to actually sort of improve the finish, even if the technology had become available, and even if the artist would have wanted that? Would it be right to, finally make this piece as it was intended, or is it actually far more authentic to keep to the surface that was created in the 70s?
Should just say that we also have a cattle prodder, and Rochelle and Em and I take it in turns to stun people away with. Your work is so tactile, I have to say, and if anyone goes there to the exhibition sort of late in the day, you'll see all these sort of footprints on the plinth.
I heard about
little
that.
footprints. I mean,
Scary.
it's so you do want to touch it. So the slide, this is my second slide with bullet points that I did warn you about. And I just want to give some context to this part of the discussion before we get Duane talking. And there are three statements here, and I'll just read them out, and we won't discuss them until after. So Wain Valentine's intent, if we can define it, is for the surface of these pieces to be pristine. Polyester, the material he uses, it has and we're not talking about the sort of ease of scratching and damage, which is also a concern, but it has an aging phenomenon, a behavior that can affect its surface. And this is one of the maquettes, actually, that Duane talked about earlier. It's in our exhibition, and it's photographed in a very extreme raking light, so the light is shone across the surface, and it picks up the surface qualities. And you can see there are these extraordinary sort of ridges, and Duane calls these growouts. And these have appeared after the piece has actually cured. The cured is finished, polished, sanded polished to a very flat surface. And we'll have him talk about those in just a second, but it's a very strange phenomenon. Obviously throws up some sort of conservation challenges. And then the other sort of statement, which is unrelated, but it becomes relevant, is that if you look at sandpaper, you can get much, much finer grades now than you could in 1975 or the 60s. So there's a possibility, there's the option of actually making the surface even more perfect if you're going to resand and repolish. As a conservation dilemma, and this is sort of what we're trying to raise awareness in our exhibition, and there are many things that you could do with Duane's pieces, but three approaches, and there'll be lots of other sort of options in the middle, but essentially, three options could be to just remove damages. So anything that's like a scratch or a scuff that is a damage can be very locally resanded and repolished, but allow the sort of age, this sort of strange aging behavior to remain. Secondly, we could ask or request that the piece is sanded back to something that we're going to define as the 1975 appearance, so that could be just limiting yourself to the grade of sandpaper that were available. And then third, of course, is to actually go further and sand it as to your best of your ability. And this is the sort of area that we had many really, well, interesting, difficult sometimes conversations. This is, just to put this into a bit more context, this is a sort of detail of Grey Column itself. Outside, so it was a very, very bright day, and it has nothing like the level of ridges that we saw in that maquette. But what it has got is this sort of orange peel effect that you can, I think, see quite well on the screen here. We can't really see it here. And this is like a grow-out. This is developed since the piece was first sanded. So the discussion we had basically was, if we took the option of not removing these ridges, we weren't trying to say this is what you should do. We were trying to keep all those options open. So by not sanding them out, they still could be sanded out. And in a way, we wanted to have this approach to raise the questions rather than sort of stamp an answer on it. So just start off, Dwayne, just describe the grow-outs. You know, when they appear, if you know why they appear, is it certain pieces they appear on, how soon do they appear, all that kind of stuff.
It's very hard to know why they appear. Well, I know why they appear in a short way. The polyester remains a liquid even though it gets hard. It's a liquid like glass is, and glass always changes as well. The glass is much more stable. And the polyester, the insides of it are moving for about 30 years. So they were perfectly pristine when they went into storage. But now, over those 30 years, it's moved. And there's grow-outs, as you will, which I call them, as the surface changes. It gets ripply or pebbly or whatever. And I sand them out and repolish it, because then usually after 30 years it doesn't do it again. And I would do it much differently now if I didn't know how. Jack Brogan has now taught me how to make it perfect, just like a sheet of glass, like I would have made it then, but didn't have the knowledge.
So do you, let's pick up on that issue, because that's very interesting. Do you think that when you made these pieces in 1975, and we had John Griswold, the conservator, talk on the film, that the hand of the artist was very evident in your pieces. They are handmade objects. You didn't have them made by a fabricator and brought back. So there is a quality to that. And unfortunately, what that tends to mean is sort of imperfections. Same way that an old LP, the scratches give the authenticity,
well,
or whatever.
One gets involved with, again, is looking at these ripples on the surface instead of seeing the piece as a colored, transparent object. And that was not my intent. I realized that, Jack refinishes Henry Moore's, after all. He's a master at it, and Henry Moore didn't do them in the first place. They were done in Italy next to Michelangelo's mountain, done in Pietrasanta. And he took them a piece of, Henry took them a piece of clay, or soft clay, modeling clay, or a plaster that was the image he was looking for. Then that was sent to Italy for the craftsmen to make. And they now are even more perfect, because everything's set up by a computer now. And a few artists that I know did a thing in their studio where they have a computer image that's translated into 3 dimensions, so that 3 dimensions can be blown up and stretched or pulled, and it's still that image, but it's modified through the computer. And similarly, it could be done in Italy, like some of Michelangelo's sculpture is attenuated rather than as the body would actually be.
But do you place any, well, you place some importance, but how much importance do you place on, so this sort of scenario that you just described, that Jack has taught you to sound things better. So would you have any issues about taking a 68 or 75 piece and making it better, because you can do a better job now, or do you think actually that what you achieved in the 60s or 70s has a value to it?
Well, I always think about making them perfect, but my wife, Kiana, says, well, they look better than some of these pieces that are manufactured because they still have soul in them, and they still show the artist's work, which I can see that. That's the truth. They don't look manufactured. You can tell that a lot of it is done by machine, but I'm holding the machine, so they're really handmade rather than machine-made.
And do you think your sort of opinions have changed? So when you were making these pieces, did you care less about this, and you become more sensitive to these issues, or has it not really changed throughout your career?
Well, I've become more sensitive now since one sees what's being done with a really dead flat surface, like they do a gravestone. But it's a dead flat surface, which I must say I do like. But it's, in terms of what Tom says about going back and redoing them, some of them I will redo because I want to see them like I originally conceived them, but didn't have the physical means to do them. So actually, I'm doing that on a few pieces. I still have some old pieces that were not finished, and they weren't cut down. There were just blocks that were to be cut down later, and I'm working on those as we speak.
So we should use the cattle prodder against you, probably, to stop you. And then, I mean, you've mentioned this term, and I haven't mentioned it, but Finnish fetish was a term that was sort of applied to a lot of the artists. It struck me that maybe we're the Finnish fetish, the conservators. We're so fascinated by these details of surface and trying to define it. I mean, do you find it just a bit, extraordinary? Do you think why we bothering, or was it?
I believe that was coined by a writer for Art Forum. Maybe it was a publisher, editor, Phil Leader. And Phil Leader, as I recall, made that statement, which all of the artists knew that it wasn't about a Finnish fetish. It was just a name that was tagged on, like abstract expressionism, which that's a tagged on name which stuck, or minimalism, which is a tacked on name that stuck. That was more of a writer's of describing a work than it was what the artist thought about. Even though when I was in Colorado in Art Forum magazine, I saw a lot of Larry Bell's work and Kenny Price's work and Craig Kaufman's work, and I thought, wow, this is what I want to do. So LA was the place to do it. The European tradition went very well from Europe to the East Coast. But from the covered wagons from the East Coast to the West Coast, it didn't carry much of a base of classical art. So it was kind of a fresh start out here, and one could do whatever one wanted to do without, it was always criticized, of course, but that's what we wanted to do. So we congregated around the West Coast because that's where other people were working with the same ideas that I and a bunch of other artists were working for, and it was a natural fit for us.
And I should point out that the image you see of the surface of Grey Column, you really can't see anything like this when it's installed upstairs unless you really look for it. And we haven't got time to go into all the details of quite a difficult time we had when you were allowing us or not to show this piece without a refinishing. But I have to say that the sort of whole time through this, the conversations, they were always completely friendly and never stressful or tense. One of our darker hours when we sort of, and then something happened, and I always tell people that we tried everything to sort of convince you to trust us to show this piece, and sticks and carrots, and we hit you with carrots and tempt you with sticks.
Chocolates.
And I think, you know, Emma and Rochelle, with, you know, you respect their opinions very, very much. And the point was that we did come to an agreement, and I you know, can't thank you enough, because it made it possible to do what we wanted to show. And the piece went to Jack Brogan's with sort of strict instructions that we wanted just the damages to be taken out, the scratches, and then the whole, which you see on the left, the sort of hand sanding to take out the damages, and then the whole piece was repolished, so it looks beautiful and shiny. And I just have yes, just have a few more shots here. This was the installation, and we'll just run through these, and we'll open up for some questions in the audience. But this is Grey Column, for the first time ever, upright. So it had always been on its side, made on its side, shown on its side. And I'm not sure whether you can tell, but the piece is actually sort of flying. It's sort of hovering. Kevin Marshall, in the foreground here, who's in the audience, our head preparator, made this amazing system where the piece is pretty much clamped with those bits of metal which have sort of rubber pads right on the surface. So there's absolutely nothing beneath the piece. It was actually a very calm moment. It was done so beautifully and sort of calmly. And Duane, you were there, and you were sort of looking very intense, and you know, we were sort of, we had cameras there, and I guess we're expecting our sort of Hollywood moment, that this piece had been in your head vertically forever and you'd never seen it, and finally you got to see it upright. And do you remember your thoughts that day of seeing this upright for the first time?
Absolutely. My eyes did get a little wetter than usual. It was so exciting, and the people installing here were so capable. In fact, I must thank all of the people I worked with have been working with at the Getty. They are such a great group to work with. They stick together with no problems, and they respond to every suggestion. And they've just been wonderful. Our new best family.
I should just not want to sort of burst that bubble completely, but your actual first words, because I wrote them down, were, "Wow, Kevin, nice gantry." And then actually, maybe 3 days later, we got the giddy phone calls, and you were very excited. But,
the gantry was incredible. It was just a great piece of machinery.
Okay, well, we're going to open up for questions now. So maybe the lights can go up in the audience, and I see some hands up already, and we have some roving microphones, and if you can just wait till you get a microphone. There's one down. Oh.
Good evening. Thank you for the wonderful evening. I have a question about the base that was added. That is a change from your original intent when they freestood, and I understand why it has to be that way. I've done a lot of seismic protection. How do you feel about that? Is that something that's quite acceptable to you at this time?
Yes, this whole process was a very, very wonderful process, and the patience that it took for the staff to go through to make this successful was wonderful.
Would you discuss a little bit the shape and the colors and just how it affected your pieces and possibly the presentation using lighting and things like that to get the effect that you intended?
Well, the color in these pieces had to be mixed so that they were very dark at the bottom, and then would taper up and become very much see-through at the time. And of course, that's due to the natural shape of the piece. As the bottom got thicker, the color got heavier. Was that a clear answer? Okay. Well, again, the colors all measured out gram by gram, and the lighting, I think, shining directly on the surface is not the best way to see them. The best way to see them is with the walls brightened up. So you can actually see the piece by looking through at the wall.
I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about what your wife was talking about, which was the soul of the piece. That's really what touched me the most and what I'm interested in.
Could you speak a little louder? It's hard to hear up here.
I was wondering if you could talk about what your wife spoke about, more about the soul of the piece.
Oh.
And what that means to you, because that's what touched me.
Well, she says that, you know, she recognizes some pieces that come out very overly fabricated and overly machined, too perfect. And what she likes is the feeling that they were handmade. And Tom does too, I get. Of course, I always want to have them brought up to the specs that I would have liked them done then, but conservators don't like that at all. Because they want to, you know, they don't want to repaint an old painting so that it's perfect. If it's old and some cracks and whatever, they want to make certain the paint doesn't fall off. But outside of that, unless you go to the Sistine Chapel where it's all redone, it doesn't look like what we think we knew of it.
Dwayne, we have a small round blue disc, and when you look at it, you see sort of a beige tint at the top. It sort of drips down a little bit. And I noticed from the side that it's actually two pieces that are put together. One seems more solid, one is more clear.
That's when I did the colored pieces. And I did a lot of study trying to get to those pieces, studying the molecular weight of the pigments and what pigments I could get to sink at the bottom, what pigments would float on top of that. And then one day the light dawned, and by tilting that mold, those particular circles were flat and flat mold. So by putting one side down and pouring the color, the bottom side would get one color, and then by pouring another color at the top, and that raised so the top was level again, but the color would change by the thickness of the color.
What's interesting is there's not much difference when you look at it from one side or the other, even though the one side is quite solid in color.
Right.
And it's sort of magical, I thought.
Thank you.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Well, again, that's like the sky changes, you know, from one color to another color. That's where it came from, my love affair with the sky and the sea, which is so dramatic here.
We've actually been debating whether to put it in a lighted area with the light coming from behind, as you said, in the wall, or leave it as it is now, sort of in the middle with, you know, sea on one side and room on the other. We'll keep playing with it. We'll have you over sometime.
Okay.
You can look at it.
If it's exposed to direct sun and heat, the side that is exposed to the sun and the heat will change. And in fact, I just finished redoing a piece that some friends in New York, Lawrence and Alice Weiner, own. And they had it sitting right in the window. And the piece did deform, which wasn't the way I intended it. So I redid it, and it's actually, you know, restoration people wouldn't like it, but it's better than it was when I did it in the first place.
Jean-Luc.
Bonsoir, bonsoir, Dwayne. Do you remember me?
Oh, Jean-Luc, ah oui.
Right, okay.
Ah oui, bien sûr.
Now, we have been friends for a long time, and I remember the old years of the late 60s when we first met. And that was the dream years. And you had a special dream, I remember very much. It was a large drawing of an enormous prism. You were saying in those days that that large prismatic shape was about half a ton, about 500 kilos, something like this. And it was hovering above the bay of Santa Monica. And the idea was to catch and control the sunlight, a little bit like the Colossus of Rhodes, you know, the sun god Helios over there.
Yes.
And that was the idea, and that drawing was fantastic. Now you are a little bit older, we are all older, we have the same age, by the way. And I was just wondering, do you still think about this amazing dream, fantasy, or futuristic idea of putting up in the air with some kind of a mechanism? I'm not sure exactly how you were planning to suspend it.
Well, Jean-Luc,
but it was...
Of course, we know that's impossible, so I did it with a collage of the sea and the sky, and then doing another shot of the prism, which you could do now very easy with Photoshop, but then actually gluing that prism in the sky, which I always want to make pieces that floated in the sky. So my paintings, which I continue to do now, are about the horizon. And this guy, John Baldessari, walked in the studio one day and he said, "Gee, Duane, you're the first contemporary artist I ever saw that did a skyscape. I like oceanscape."
But I wanted to thank you for one thing. I was allowed to catch with my own hands a rainbow. Do you remember in the back of your room, you had a large 30-foot long rod in polyester, and that rod would change light. It was a dark room. And all of us, I mean, the few people that you were in those days, I mean, friends with, we could actually catch the rainbow, which was, I think, a fantastic experience. Do you remember that?
Of course. I still have it was taken apart, and I still have the pieces
you still have
to make that, yes. And in fact, my son Nelson and I did another installation of that at PS1 in New York City. And surprisingly enough, PS1, these pieces are all about daylight, so none of them were done with artificial light. So it's hard to imagine PS1 now letting an artist drill 2 holes in the roof to do this piece. But that's the piece that you knew in Venice that went diagonally across the 30 by 30 foot room and up through the ceiling and out through the roof and bringing the daylight in. And it was an eerie, wonderful experience for me. And at night on a full moon, it did a really, really mysterious thing in the moonlight, when the moon was directly overhead.
We'll take one more question, Albrecht.
Good evening. I'm very intrigued by the dilemma that you must have gone through to improve. I'm very intrigued by the dilemma that you must have gone through to improve the piece now, to make it perfect as you wished. What was the argument that kept you from doing so?
To redoing those pieces again perfect? Yes. Well, it's the conservators really that have done that to me. One conservator, I won't mention names, but got very perturbed that a piece of mine was redone by Jack Brogan, and one side of it was made all perfectly smooth. And they wanted the piece exactly it was, but just polished up to snuff. And I was there when that conversation went on. So the second side was left just like it was, but just polished. And it's at La Jolla right now. You can look at it. If you look at it closely, you see one side's very flat, and the other side is, looks handmade.
Is the microphone still down here? We do have one more. Could we get the microphone down for one more? I know I said that was the last question, but it's just down the front here. Better be a good question. Thank you.
Thank you for tonight. It's been wonderful. One of the things I was curious about, I remember being in your studio probably around 1970, and when you talk now, as in the film, about the fact that those huge drums were, I think, $250 each. How could you afford to have 10 or more? In your studio, the artists that I remember did not have that kind of money to put out.
I had this wonderful gallery, Ace Gallery, and I had a stipend from Ace Gallery, and Jennifer from Ace Gallery is right there. And there was no project I couldn't think of that Doug Christmas wouldn't fund. So I had a very good free hand, and I felt like I could do anything that I wanted, which was wonderful. So I'd get the barrels, and I'd get the funds from Ace Gallery, and just over and over and over did pieces. Of course, the big pieces, the 10 drum pieces, were commissions by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And I usually got a half down, which always scared me to death by the time I got half through and I realized it was going to cost me 4 times as much to do it. But at least it got the projects off the ground, got the material in the studio.
Great. I just have a few more slides just to round us off. I couldn't quite fit these 4 into any category. And I was expecting someone to make a certain question in relation to a certain movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey, which most journalists seem to mention. But, and remind you of anything?
This piece in the movie wasn't released yet. The movie wasn't. And a woman who worked at Ace Gallery, Gail Mutrix, was married to a filmmaker, and she picked a filmmaker from New York, and he walked into the studio and his feet actually went like that, and he said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "Oh, Stanley should have seen this." It was one of the people that worked with him on the film, and it was very, it was very good to see that and to see this. And of course, I wished he'd have used my piece.
You have an affection with forklift trucks, don't you?
Well, I have some very good employees, but this was always dependable. It my most dependable employee. In fact, let's see, I was moving one of these with this thing through my parking lot. I was going to put it in the other part of my studio, and the forklift and that piece, the forklift went right through the pavement, sunk to its belly, and had to get Tom's crane man to lift my forklift out of the hole, and the crane to move the piece off the forklift. So it's a trial and error of artists.
I like it that I have a crane man now.
Yes, and the crane man was excellent. He was so good. He was so gentle.
This, Commonwealth Projects, who made the movie and our catalogue and everything else, they're here in the audience also. They followed you around a lot of this. This was what we were seeing a lot. Did it bother you? Did you love it? What was that like?
To love it and sell it?
The whole process with working with these guys and having cameras on you the whole time.
Wonderful, because as I say, none of these things could have been done without a lot of assistance. When I moved down to Torrance, I had a lot of material and electrical stuff and timbers, and I still had some molds for pieces, and a friend of mine, Fred Nicholas, gave me this trailer that the Sam Francis Foundation had been using, and I loaded it with building materials and pulled it down to I had a semi-truck pull it down to Torrance, where we live now, and bag it in and park it. And it was only a couple of weeks ago that I had an assistant who needed a job to do I was kind of slow in the studio right then. So he got in, reorganized everything, and now I can actually walk in it. Before you had to support yourself on a bunch of wiggly boards. But that was full, and the 6 oceanic containers are full of artist detritus. And a bunch of pieces are still in the crate sitting out in my backyard. The thing that interested me about this building, I'd always lived on the west side. And I was looking all over the west side for a studio. And it was right when the dot-com guys came along. Everything was leased, rented, sold to computer guys. So a real estate man brought me down to Torrance, and I thought Torrance, the end of the world. I think I'd only been there a couple of times. And he showed me this building, which had 2-foot by 6-foot windows in it. The building was almost 90 feet long, and it was a cave with a 7.5-foot drop ceiling. And I said, I can't use this, but I was being forced out of both Peter Alexander and I were being forced out of our studios in the industrial area in the marina, so I had to move it someplace. So I got this place. It took me 10 years to get straightened up, but this is an interesting shot. Do you want to talk about this, Tom?
Yeah. I think you should tell us what this is. My final slide, and this was a lovely moment.
This is the day that Keanu and I got married, and that's my black and white marriage boots. And
just about a month ago. Right?
Yeah. After we were afraid that for the first 7 years it'd be a bad romance, ended up in marriage, or good romance ended up in a bad marriage. So we finally got over that. I finally got over that. So we got married down at the La Jolla Museum, and there was a boot shot, and the bottle of Krug, which we actually drank warm in the sunshine, didn't taste anything like champagne, but it was a good celebration.
And who was it that married you?
Pardon me?
And who was it that married you?
Oh, interesting story. We were looking around for a minister and some place to get married, where we thought about, well, we'll go to La Jolla, not La Jolla, we'd go to Catalina and get married in Catalina. And there was a woman there who had a service. She was both on the mainland and Catalina, and she got marriage licenses and got people married. And I was talking about it with Jack Brogan, and he said, "Oh, I'll marry you." And I said, "What do you mean, Jack?" And he said, "I'm a minister. I'm a registered minister." So Jack Brogan, who does everything else for us, did that for us. And in the middle of the thing, he said, "I'm not going to say for better or for worse, because you've already been through it."
Well, listen, we're going to wrap up now, and we're going to move outside to have in our case, a well-earned glass of wine. And you'll notice outside there's a bookstore where you can buy our catalogue, 10% off tonight. Before we thank Dwayne, I just wanted to thank particularly Emma Richardson and Rochelle Revank, my co-curators, who've been fantastic through this entire project. Emma, who tonight has done amazing things in the AV booth as well, for things she's stuck back there. Anna Zagorski and Gary Masson, who've both been amazing at organising this event with me. And finally to Gus, Chris and Heather, the other AV people. But finally, Dwayne, thank you so much. It's been a wonderful evening. Thank you.